The chief operator came to me one day and said, "Mabel, could I talk to you for a few minutes?" And I thought to myself, my goodness, what have I done wrong? Because you immediately think that something has happened. And my mother had called her and told her that my baby brother had been killed in Normandy.
Today we're here with Miss Mable. She's going to share a little bit about her early life, her upbringing, and just life experiences. So why don't you start us off?
My name is Mable McDonough, and I'm 98 years old, and I love life. I've had such a good life. I was born in Stuart, Florida, lived there until I was about 3 or 4 years old, and my parents moved to Pompano. And I had a good life there. My dad was injured in World War I, and he wasn't home much of the time. He was in the hospital at Bay Pines, Florida. And if you know where that is, that's up on the Panhandle. And back in those days, that was the only hospital for servicemen to go to. So that was a long ways for us to keep in touch with him. And my mother was one of the best mothers in the world. I often tell people what a great upbringing that I had because she was so good. But we didn't have any money. She was a seamstress, and she would go to people's homes and make their drapes or make couch covers. And she was so good because she could look at a picture and cut a pattern. And I had three siblings. My oldest brother was 2 years older than my sister was 2 years older than my other brother. And then I was born. I was the baby of the family, so of course my family spoiled me a little bit, but I had a good life. And my dad was not there much of the time because he was in and out of the hospital because he was not well from his injury at the service. And I found out later in life that he might have been an alcoholic. And one thing that I found out just about 8 years ago, and I never had heard this during my lifetime. My mother and dad were divorced at the beginning of the Depression because we had very little money. And the way I found it out, I was doing my genealogy, which I love to do, and I was looking at the records in Fort Lauderdale, in the courthouse records. And I was so surprised when I came upon my dad's name, and it couldn't be mistaken because his name was Robert Alonzo Knight, and right under it was Ethel May Knight. So there was no question that it was my mom and dad. And I thought this was strange because no one had ever mentioned that. I think it could have been because my mother was a seamstress, and of course, during the Depression, people were not sewing as much or getting new drapes and things like that, so she may not have had as much work as she had always had before. So I just figured that when I read it, that was what was happened because 2 years later, in the same records that I was working in the courthouse, showed where they were remarried. And my dad passed away when I was 10 years old. My brother went through school, but he had to drop out when he was in the 12th grade because he had to help my mother financially. And there was an organization called the CCC's, Civilian Conservation Corps, and they planted trees in North Florida and Georgia. And so he joined that, and they would send his money home at the end of the month and give him a little bit to keep, but he helped my mother financially.
Is there any interesting things that you can share, maybe more about your dad's experience in the war? Do you know how he was injured or anything like that?
I really don't, because I was about I was really young when he was with me, and the family just never talked about those things.
Well, what can you remember about your school days? How was your experience? How did you do in school? Did you have any extracurricular activities?
I really enjoyed school. I had a lot of really good teachers. I went to Pompano, and it wasn't called Pompano Beach at that time. It was just plain Pompano. I had two girlfriends, Merlene and Betty Jean, and we were called the three. We stayed together all the time, and I really enjoyed spending time at their house. And I still keep in touch with them. Up until about 4 or 5 years ago, I lost track of one of them. One lived in North Carolina, and the other one lives in Texas. Then, when I got in the 12th grade, during the summer, my mother had to move to Fort Lauderdale because she got a job there that she could make more money than what she was making sewing. So we moved to Fort Lauderdale, but I really didn't want to go to the high school there. They had only one high school in Fort Lauderdale at that time, and it was just too many people in the senior class. I just didn't want to attend. And my mother checked around, and she found a private school that we could afford, that there were only 16 seniors in the class. So I went to and graduated from Fern Hall Private School. During the summer that year, before I started to school, I started working at the telephone company. And I began as an operator. I worked all night, and servicemen would come in to Fort Lauderdale, to the local port. And of course, the first thing they did was call their parents or call their friends or their girlfriend. And so many times we would monitor the conversation and listen in to make sure they had a good connection. And many times we would hear them say, "Mom, I can't talk very long because this is my last money. I have no more change." Of course, when they finished their conversation, and I'm not the only one that did it, we all kind of did, we would accidentally hit the wrong key and return their money when they hung up. Now, I realize now that that was the wrong thing to do, but I'm sure that I wasn't alone because I saw others do the same thing. But I was only on the board about 6 months when the chief operator wanted me to do some clerical work because I could type. So she gave me a job as a clerical work, and I was no longer a switchboard operator.
Can you think of any other ways that World War II affected your life at the time?
The chief operator came to me one day and said, "Mable, could I talk to you for a few minutes?" And I thought to myself, my goodness, what have I done wrong? Because you immediately think that something has happened. So she took me in the conference room where they usually took girls whenever they wanted to. reprimand them or make changes. And my mother had called her and told her that my baby brother had been killed in Normandy. He had been shot when they were landing at Normandy, and he lived for about 2 months before he passed away. And they buried him in St. Lo, France. And that was devastating because he was the brother that was next to me. And when I wanted to go places, he was the one that always took me places. And so that was devastating. That was one of the worst points in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And when the war ended, the government brought him back home, and he's buried in Pompano next to my mother. It did really affect me because he and I were so close. But then I was at my aunt's house one afternoon and enjoying time with my cousin, who was a little bit younger than I, and that was when I was around 19 or 20 years old. And my cousin delivered papers to the community that my aunt lived in. And so this young man stopped by and left him some papers. And I happened to be swinging in the swing with my blue jeans and t-shirt on. And he looked over and saw me there, but didn't say anything that day. And then the next day when he came back to deliver papers to my cousin, he asked my aunt, who was the girl that was swinging in the swing yesterday? And so she told him all about me. And he said, well, I'd kind of like to meet her. My mother was very strict with me, and she had to know everything about anyone and their parents and all before I was allowed to date with them, even though I was 19 years old. And the next night, he knocked on my door. My mother went to the door because she knew he was coming and met him because she knew a lot about him that my aunt had told him all about. And he came in and Mother introduced him to me. And then I remembered seeing him the day before. Well, he asked if we could go for ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother allowed me to do that. We went to ice cream, and of course I had to be home by 10 o'clock. Now remember, this was years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but parents were a little bit more strict way back then. The next night, guess who showed up? He showed up again. He managed to stop by Fort Lauderdale by my address almost every other day. And we had a visit, sometimes at home, sometimes we would go for a ride, sometimes we would go to a movie. But 1 month later, he asked me to marry him.
Wow, he didn't waste time.
Didn't waste any time at all.
That's great.
My mother thought it was too soon. I didn't know him long enough, but during this time, he was coming all the way to Fort Lauderdale on Sundays and going to church with me every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would spend the afternoon. We would go to Miami later on in the afternoon and attend his church in Miami with his family. So even by a month, I had known his family quite well.
Mm-hmm.
But when we set the date, we set it for January the 20th. And my mother thought that was too soon after we knew. We should know each other a little bit longer than that before we got married. I was only 20 years old, and I had to be 21 in order to get married without her signature. And at first, she said, I just can't sign those papers for you to get married because I really don't want you to. And I think that was the first time in my life that I ever went against my mother and her thoughts. And I said, Mom, I'm going to be 21 in February. I won't need your signature. So she came around.
Okay.
And about a month after we were married, she was taken up for him instead of taken up for me. She loved him when she had been around him for a while. Most women back in my day went into nursing as their occupation and life work. And my sister went to college in Miami at Jackson Memorial Hospital. She trained to be a nurse. And she went into the nurses training the same year that I went into high school. And we both graduated at the same time. And of course, when I graduated from Fort Lauderdale, the private school, my mother wanted me to go into nurses training because she had planned that all along. And I didn't want to because I had already been working for the telephone company for a little over a year. And I was happy where I worked. And I talked her into letting me stay. And the main reason that I was able to do that, I was making more at the telephone company than my sister was making in her first job as a registered nurse. And so I knew that I could go just as far there as I would go in nurses training. And I enjoyed what I was doing. And I did. I had so much fun working for the telephone company because we were able to bid out when we found other jobs that we would prefer to be in. So I worked in every plant, traffic, the plant department, and wound up in engineering. I finished my telephone career with 30 years service, and I was the district engineer's secretary. But after I had 30 years service, my husband and I decided that we needed something a little bit more. And his mother was retiring from her. She owned a bookstore in Miami, Florida, a Christian bookstore. It was called Bible Bookstore on 125th Street. We bought her store and kept it for probably 15 or 20 years. It was wonderful.
Any particular stories that stick out for you with your time there at the store?
There were 2 nuns that came in the store at one time, and they wanted to talk to the manager. And they came back, and I was the one that they had come to talk to. And they said, we would love to talk in your to shop in your store because we've been given permission. I didn't realize that they weren't allowed to come in a Christian bookstore. But they came in, and I spent a lot of time showing them around and showing them where everything was. And we had one section of just books for the Catholic Church. And they were really amazed at that. I loved selling Bibles. Had a man come in one time, and I was showing Bibles to these two young ladies, and he interrupted me and he said, "Don't show those kind of Bibles. The only one you show is the King James Version." And I got so upset with him, but I couldn't lose my temper. And I talked to him and told him about the different translations and everything. But we decided Family Bookstore came and wanted to buy all of our stores. And we had one in Boca, one in Delray, and one in Miami. But of course, we drove to Miami every day because it was a large store and we had to take care of it. So we had a great marriage. We were married 70 years to be exact.
Wow.
And a lot of changes because when we got married, we did not have a honeymoon because we were both pretty poor. We had rented a little apartment. When I say apartment, it was a half of a garage behind the chief of police's house. But I found out not too long after that I was expecting my first child. And we were married in January, and Kathy was born in December. So we had to find a better place. We looked around. We had signed a year's lease for this apartment, but the chief of police, and his name was R.C. Croft at that time, he and his wife, Mamie, were so wonderful. They helped me a lot in my early days of marriage. And they broke the lease and said that if we found an apartment, that we didn't have to worry about staying there a full year. So we found this little house, and we only paid $2,000 for it. It was kind of out west of Delray, and it had not a bedroom, but a kind of a screened-in porch. Had a big living room and a kitchen and a bathroom. But we only had to pay $2,000 for it, so we lived there for 4 years before we found a house that was bigger for our family. Because by that time, 22 months later, Patty came along. And I was working for the telephone company in Delray Beach because we had moved to Delray. Had a great beginning of our time together. And 12 years later, we had Terry. That was a little bit of a surprise, but it was wonderful.
So how did you manage, just you and your husband with these babies coming along? How did you manage them? Were you able to stay at home when they were little and then they went to school, or how did that work?
I continued working the whole time because I had a mother that was so great, and she would come and help me with the kids and take care of them. As a matter of fact, when Kathy and Patty were small, she rented an apartment that one of my neighbors had and lived right next door, so she was right there to take care of them when they came from school. During that time, we started going to North Carolina. A friend of ours had a log cabin in Franklin, North Carolina, that not in Franklin. It was called Cashers. And we started going up there and visiting in their cabin and really enjoyed it and bought property up there. And we built a little house, and my mother-in-law liked to go up there with us, and she decided that they would buy a house in Franklin. And we bought that from her when my father-in-law passed away. So we sold the houses in Cashers and moved to Franklin for our summer vacations. And we still own those houses up there and really enjoy going to there and staying and having fun.